Hi class, today we're going to talk about economic development. We're going to define economic development, compare it with economic growth, which we've already discussed in a previous video, and we're going to spend a little time talking about different indicators that we can use to measure economic development. There was a quote in one of the assigned readings for this week: indicators are a tool to put more information into the hands of more people, information that can inspire action and lead to better decision making. We spend a lot of time at the onset of this class talking about how we measure different things. And I wanted to just emphasize the importance there and why we spend so much time talking about these indicators or metrics, so these quantitative measures of different economic constructs, is because at the end of the day, this is what we're going to use, whether we're individuals making decisions, tribal governments, state governments, nonprofits, businesses. These measures are going to help us understand the kind of realities on the ground, and help us hopefully make better decisions when it comes to whether it's public policy or just decisions in our own lives. So what is economic development? Economic development refers to the programs, policies, or activities that seek to improve the economic well-being and quality of life for a community. You might recall when we discussed economic growth, we also discussed some of the downsides to using GDP or GDP growth as a measurement of well-being. It gives you certainly some indication of how well a community is doing, but it excludes a lot of important things, and it maybe doesn't accurately reflect other aspects of well-being. So as a response to that, economic development typically takes a much broader view and uses much broader metrics than just the traditional economic metrics of GDP, unemployment, inflation. A related concept is human development. Human development is defined as the process of enlarging people's freedoms and opportunities and improving their well-being. So again, focused on well-being at the end of the day. You may have heard of the Human Development Index. It is referenced in the Arctic Social Indicators reading. It was developed in 1990 and has been broadly adopted by the UN as well as a lot of nonprofits. It's very widely used globally and in the US. In addition to including income or GDP per capita, it also measures health of a population as well as educational attainment of a population. So this makes sense both if you're looking at a broader idea of community well-being, because income alone doesn't give a complete picture. If GDP is going up because people are spending lots of money on healthcare because everyone's sick, it's not ideal. But it also makes sense because even if you're only focused on traditional economic indicators, because in the long run, your labor force is going to be more productive and able to work and contribute longer if they are healthier and if they have obtained higher levels of education. So let's dive into some of the specific metrics that a couple of your readings suggested are appropriate for measuring economic development in rural Alaska. So the first was the ICER technical report, and I want to call your attention to this table. They highlight a number of metrics that they suggest using for understanding the economy of rural Alaska. This includes population and student enrollment, exam pass rates, the dropout rate, the share of school children receiving free or reduced price lunch, and the price of fuels. So you'll notice quite a few of these revolve around education. Not only are schools in the village a central part of village life, there have been a number of cases when population falls off in a village and they no longer have enough young people to support a school. In many ways, it can be devastating to a village, and then you'll see additional population flight from there. So the health of schools really does relate to the health of a rural village. But also, the ICER technical report focuses on these particular metrics because it's data that is obtainable and required to be reported. The Arctic Social Indicators, on the other hand, propose quite a few different measurements than the ICER technical report. And the reason why I have you guys look at the Arctic Social Indicators, these were developed to help reflect the economic development and economic reality of not only rural Alaska, but of similar areas across the entire Arctic region. So you'll find there's a lot of commonalities between the rural areas of Arctic Alaska and Canada and Scandinavian countries. They have some commonalities. And so there were 6 major categories for the Arctic Social Indicators, including things like fate control, which has a lot to do with the self-determination of Indigenous people and the ability to kind of guide their own destiny. And this is maybe not something you would traditionally think about when you're talking about economic growth, or possibly even economic development outside of an Indigenous context. But because the population of rural Alaska and the rural areas in the other Arctic states is so majority Indigenous, it makes sense possibly to have this as part of an indicator. So you can look at some of the examples of proposed metrics in that category, things like percentage of Indigenous members in governing bodies relative to the percentage of Indigenous people in the total population. Some of the other categories include cultural vitality. Again, this relates to the fact that we have a very high Indigenous population in the area. Contact with nature. Material well-being, which is the only place you're going to find traditional economic indicators like GDP per capita. Education, so similar to that ICER technical report, and then health and demography. So these are things like infant mortality, percent of population within 1 hour of a healthcare facility. So as you read the Arctic Social Indicators, I only assigned you the first chapter in that report, but if you got a little deeper into the report, you would see that these measures were developed in this really robust process, consulting both academic experts, policy experts, as well as in local residents of the communities, of rural communities in the Arctic. And so many of these are wonderful indicators, but the reality was it ended up being very difficult, even through the best efforts to select indicators where data was available, to actually collect this data. Talking a little bit about that, both ICER and the Arctic Social Indicators report talk about how their process, how they went about picking these particular metrics. So ICER talks about the availability, usefulness, quality, coverage, and redundancy of the data that they selected. For Arctic Social Indicators, they talked about data availability, data affordability, the ease of measurement, robustness, scalability, and inclusiveness. There are some overlap in these concepts. But you can see that maybe the Arctic Social Indicators had a couple additional metrics like inclusiveness that weren't covered with the ICER technical report. So I highlight this in part because I ask you to think about how would you go about picking criteria or measures to understand the realities of rural Alaska. Knowing that in an ideal world we'd have lots of data, but we live in a world where collecting this data can be incredibly challenging in remote and rural circumstances. So I will turn it over to you to give that some thought.